Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this episode, we're going to look into the globalization of anti-Semitism through the Globalize the Intifada movement. We will also look into the history of the Intifada and the current media blackout on anti-Semitism. Let's get started. During the first 4 years of the conflict, more than 3,600 Molotov cocktail attacks, 100 grenade attacks, and 600 assaults with guns or explosives were reported. Palestinians were stabbed, hacked with axes, shot, clubbed, burned with acid. The justification offered for these killings varied. The startling pictures were tragic events taking place within the Palestinian territories, and there's no excuse for this type of death and destruction and harm to the Palestinian people. Nobody can justify these actions taken against the Palestinian people. I'm sure we can all agree that we should be calling out the people who are responsible for these type of actions, the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian leaders who took these horrible actions against their own people. Sadly, this treatment of their own people doesn't just end with their own people. The Palestinian leadership turned their eye to harming Jewish people as well. This is just a little preview of what has been known as the Intifada. The first Intifada, or uprising, is recognized as beginning on December 6, 1987, when an Israeli was stabbed to death while shopping in the area of Gaza. One day later, 4 residents of the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza were killed in a traffic accident. Rumors began to spread in the Palestinian communities that the 4 had actually been killed by Israelis as a deliberate act of revenge. Mass rioting broke out in the Jabalia camp, which led to a 17-year-old youth being killed by Israeli soldiers after throwing a Molotov cocktail at an army patrol. This soon sparked a wave of unrest and engulfed the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. Over the next week, Palestinian rock throwing, blocked roads, and burning tires were reported throughout the territories. Rioters even threw gasoline bombs at the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem. In Gaza, rumors circulated that the Palestinian youths that were wounded by Israeli soldiers were being taken to an army hospital near Tel Aviv and killed. Another rumor claimed that Israeli troops poisoned the water reservoirs in Khan Younis. A UN official said that these stories were completely untrue. Only the most seriously injured Palestinians were taken out of Gaza for treatment, and in some cases this probably saved their lives. The water was also tested by the UN and there was no contamination found. Palestinians were not simply targeting soldiers from Israel, but also looked to attack average Israeli citizens. During this period of the Intifada, 16 Israeli civilians and 11 soldiers were killed by Palestinians. More than 1,400 Israeli civilians and 1,700 Israeli soldiers were injured. Approximately 1,100 Palestinians were also killed in clashes between the Israeli troops and rioters. Jews, however, were not the only victims of the violence. A number of Arabs were killed for political and other reasons by Palestinian death squads in what amounted to what they call an intifada. This number of deaths exceeded the number of killed in clashes between Palestinians and Israeli troops. The gruesome and disturbing scenes that I painted before were from this intifada in Palestinian-on-Palestinian violence. PLO chairman at the time, Yasser Arafat, defended the killing of Arabs deemed to be collaborating with Israel. He delegated the authority to carry out these executions to the Intifada leadership. After the murders, the local PLO death squad sent their files to the PLO. Quote, "We have studied the files of those who were executed and found that only 2 out of the 118 that were executed were innocent," Arafat said himself. The innocent victims were declared martyrs of the Palestinian Revolution by the PLO. Eventually, the reign of terror became so serious within the Palestinian territories that some Palestinians expressed public concern about the disorder in the region. The PLO began to call for the end of the violence, but the murders by its own members and rivals continued. From 1989 to 1992, this intifada claimed the lives of nearly 1,000 Palestinians. This was Palestinian-on-Palestinian violence. There was some relative calm between the Palestinians and the Israelis in the 90s due to the Oslo Accords in 1993. It wasn't until the 2000s that Second Intifada was called by Palestinian leadership. On September 28, 2000, Israeli politician and Likud leader Ariel Sharon went to visit the Temple Mount, Judaism's holiest site, which Muslims also call Haram al-Sharif and regarded as the third holiest site for Muslims. This incident was used by Palestinians as a reason to walk away from the Oslo Accords and have their pre-planned Second Intifada. It turns out that Israel's internal security minister permitted Sharon to visit the Temple Mount only after first calling the Palestinian security chief and receiving his assurance that if Sharon did not enter the mosque, no problems would arise. The need to protect Sharon arose when the Palestinian security chief later said that the Palestinian police would do nothing to prevent violence against him at the visit. This unofficially sanctioned any political violence by Palestinians against the Israeli leader. In addition, the official Palestinian Authority media advocated for violence by the Palestinians. The Voice of Palestine, the Palestinian Authority's official radio station, sent out calls, quote, to all Palestinians to come and defend Al-Aqsa Mosque. The PA closed its schools and bused Palestinian students to the Temple Mount to participate in the organized riots. Just prior to Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, when hundreds of Israelis were worshipping at the Western Wall, thousands of Arabs began throwing bricks and rocks at the Israeli police and Jewish worshippers below at the Temple Mount. Rioting then spread to towns and villages throughout Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. On November 7, 2000, an investigation led by a former U.S. senator was established to determine the cause of the violence and make recommendations for calming the situation. What's known as the Mitchell Report was issued in April 2001, and it concluded that Ariel Sharon's visit to Al-Aqsa Mosque was not the cause of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. In 2017, a former Palestinian negotiator admitted that in 2000, Saudi King Abdullah, then Crown Prince, provided the Palestinians with $500 million and collected another $500 million from the Arab League in order to keep the Intifada going. The Second Intifada did a great deal of damage in the peace process and for the Israeli-Palestinian relation. We saw a, quote, state-sanctioned violence by Palestinian leadership to harm Israeli citizens. However, often overlooked is the fact that many Palestinian and Arab people were also murdered by Palestinians during the Intifada. When we come back, we're going to see how the First and Second Intifada and state-sanctioned violence against the Israelis has come into the 21st century. We'll be right back on the Jewish Diaspora Report.